And here we are with another episode of All Things Conflict with me, your host, Maria Arper. And before we get into it, I'm excited to tell you about my flagship dialogue roadmap training. So if you see yourself as someone that would like to master the art of communication and dialogue and help people through difficult conversations and conflicts and all the areas in life where talking gets sticky, then you might be interested. It's 20 days of intensive training supported over the course of a year with a small selected group of people from all walks of life. And if you think this might be for you, I'm just at the beginning of thinking about the 2027 cohort. So you can contact me at mariaarper.com. Welcome to another episode of All Things Conflict with me, your host, Maria Arper. Following on from some of the themes around child sexual exploitation and the way we do or don't listen to children, I'm really happy to welcome onto the podcast Alex Renton, who is an investigative journalist and has put an immense amount of time and resource into exploring paedophilia and why people offend in this way. And what makes it really special is because he is actually a victim of child sexual abuse. And so let's listen to what he has to say. Thank you. Well, Alex, thank you for coming on the podcast, All Things Conflict. I'm really delighted to have you on. I mean, we had the most fascinating conversation a couple of days ago. I mean, there are so many strings to your bow. You're an investigative journalist and with a lot of lived experience and really interesting insights and real evidence and research. So why don't you just introduce yourself first of all, and then I can pick it up from there.
Introduce myself. Do you want the modest version or the egotistical one? I mean, I suppose so. Yes, I mean, I've been a journalist all my life. I'm lucky to have been alive in the age when journalism was still well funded, and and it was a proper career. It's harder, much harder these days. And yes, I think really because of my background as a child, I've always been interested in vulnerable people and authority, challenging authority and sticking up for the small person, if you like. And in recent years, that's become more about books and TV and radio broadcasts and very in different areas. But the one that's really grabbed me in it, and particularly at the moment because I've just finished another book on it, which will be out next year, is child sexual abuse and which is something that I suffered as a child, aged 9, and I think I've been asking why ever since I was 9 years old. It's a good thing for a journalist, kind of turned me into a journalist, and really asking, why and how you keep children safe today, because I think you can. I think we can do. You read headlines saying child sexual abuse is nearly quadrupled in 10 years. Incidents reported to the police, but there are ways of addressing it. I think children can be safe, but we as a society are going to have to make some changes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it, is being able to say, as someone who was sexually abused yourself, and maybe you'll tell us about that later on. But, to be able to say it is actually possible for us to keep children safe. And when you, as a journalist, that question why comes up, so for me, it's so why aren't we?
Yes, absolutely. And that's really, and I think the research I've been doing over the last year for this, I'm not here to plug the new book. It's not out for months, but it, really showed me that we have been making enormous mistakes about in policy and in policing of this huge problem. And in understanding of children and listening to children. We didn't do that in the past, and discounting their experiences and not believing them. But kind of the areas we make now in public policy around child safeguarding and so on, and indeed stopping people who have a sexual interest in children from offending. And that's a lot of people with that predilection. National Crime Agency says 840,000 adults are a risk, sexual risk to children at any one time. But those problems are kind of been in our society throughout the 20th century. The same issues, but that's you can take that as terrible or encouraging. And I prefer to say encouraging because we can act. There is hope.
Yeah, I mean, I heard you say that the problems have been around in the 20th century, but would you not think that perhaps these problems have been going on for a very long time throughout history, and what we have now is the ability to expose, on some level, we can talk about the internet and online being a terrible thing, but it does help people to uncover things, and it does bring things to light and to the surface that perhaps networks of people would have been able to keep hidden.
Yes, no, I think that those aspects have obviously changed enormously, though online has brought a new form of offending, which is online sexual abuse material, pornography, which we need to talk about as a society, and you and I. But no, I mean, it's perfectly clear if you go into the psychology of deviant sexualities, that particular predilection has been around forever. What we failed to do, and there's always been a significant proportion of the population. And if you go, as I have been, back into police records and newspaper reports, I mean, you first see that word child abuse, usually meaning sexual, appearing in about the 1860s. And the first big scandals, the first sort of big elite paedophile conspiracy scandal in the British newspapers dates to 1886 in the huge story, fascinating story, actually. What's changed, as you say, Maria, is the way we understand it as a society, and the tools we have at our hands to protect children better, to safeguard better, DBS thing, and better law as well. And the changes in the law you couldn't rape a 13-year-old girl until the 1950s. It literally wasn't called rape; it was called an indecent assault. So a lot of things have changed. But then on the other hand, there are some policy issues driven around ignorance and misunderstanding of the actual threat and the nature of the people that remain just as bad as they've ever been.
So that, for me, I mean, that really kind of piques my interest when I hear you say that, the misunderstandings and the we've got laws, we've got policies, we've got all sorts of things coming out of our ears. The bureaucracy is all there. The safety net supposedly is there, and yet it's not really effective. So maybe you could speak to that.
No, absolutely. I mean, this has been a learning process for me. I was, along with many of my schoolmates, sexually abused by a teacher in a small posh private boarding school, 8 to 13 in Sussex in the 1970s. And what I took from that was, I disclosed. I mean, I told my mum, and my mum went to the school and they shut her up and so on. And then the teacher was actually sacked a few months later, but he was given a reference and he went to other schools. So I thought that was the problem, that bad institutions, the NHS, the BBC covered up Jimmy Savile for years, and places like my school, care homes, where adults disbelieved the children and put the reputation of the institution. That was more important than keeping the children safe. And that seemed to me, that made me furious, made me, much more angry than I was at the disgusting man who fiddled with us. He was sick, but these were grown-ups with who should have known better. I mean, it was the elite, the establishment. But of course, the big gap in my thinking was the sort of abuse I suffered in an institution is a really tiny proportion of overall. And I mean, you know this, and societies, we've all known this for decades, but you are, as a child, far more likely to be sexually abused in your own home by a relative or by someone the family knows and trusts you, the family circle, if you like. That accounts for around 50 or 55% of all recorded crimes. And that's against sex crimes against children. And that's been known for decades. But we as a society prefer stranger danger. That's much more acceptable. Thinking that the people, Uncle so and so, or or the nice neighbor, that's a risk to your child. That is really hard to accept. But going, oh, it's immigrants with different colored skins, or it's the dirty old man in the van with a packet of sweets, that we can accept. But so the first thing about addressing, the if you, let's say 500,000 children sexually abused in Britain every year, NSPCC figures, addressing that is looking and educating ourselves and educating children to say you can tell, you will be heard. So that's the beginning of the big social change we need to make. And so I should let you speak, I think, probably. But I tend to bang on, Maria. You know this from when we've talked before.
No, not at all. I think, as I said, you've got lived experience and you've put a huge amount of resource and personal energy into trying to understand. You haven't just sat on the sidelines going, let's just string everybody up and shoot them. You've actually put time and effort into trying to understand the problem because, at the end of the day, we don't live in a society where we put people in prison and execute them and we never have to see them again. People could go to prison, but they're coming out at some point.
Yes.
And so, a lot of what we do, even when we're being punitive, is superficial.
Yes.
And I think, for me, what was really interesting in talking to you is as someone, as a victim, to be able to say, no, let's go deeper. Let's look under, let's turn over the stones and have a look because, I work in prisons and a significant amount of the prisoners I work with, no matter what crime they may be in for, were abused as children,
Yes.
Sexually abused or violently abused, but in some way had safety taken away from them.
Yes, and absolutely, left angry and without the emotional control that most of us hope to have to get through life and so on. No, I think every psychologist who works in prison and people that you do your fantastic work and so on knows exactly that. And I think the great problem. So at the moment, the last time I looked, there's about 20,000 sex offenders in prison at any one time. That's nearly 20% of the whole prison population. And nearly half of those are child sex offenders. So it's a huge number of people. But horrifyingly, less than 11% get rehabilitation therapy training to stop them reoffending in prison. And I think, one of the phrases that the site, I've spent a lot of time with people who do counsel, sitting in on sessions with people counseling sex offenders or people who haven't offended yet but think they might, and to find ways to stop them offending. You can't cure it, but you can give people systems to not offend. And it is in this crime we only stop child molesters after they've molested. Whereas in the modern world, you need to stop crimes before they happen, and with most crimes, we have ways of doing that. So that's another of the things we have to get our heads around: is that we can spend 1 billion a year policing child sexual abuse, but we spend 5 million a year trying to stop people before they abuse.
Well, the
And that
problem is,
includes
how can you
educating
tell
children.
anyone? How can you
Sorry?
tell? How can the problem is? Where are the forums for people to say, I feel sexually attracted towards children. I desperately don't want to do anything about it. I know, it will get me in a lot of trouble. It will create a lot of harm, but I could be able to talk about it. Those places rarely exist.
Yeah, and so that's exactly my question. I mean, and so I went to Germany, where since 2005 they've had this program called the Dunkelfeld program, um, which and literally on buses and in metro stations in Berlin, you can still see TV adverts going, a young man sitting there with a child sitting opposite him on the bus and so on, and going, "What are you thinking? call us before your thinking, which is not a crime, goes to something that is a crime. So they've been actively encouraging people to come forward. And but then but the key thing, Mary, is, and you worked in public service, is that in Germany, there's a government mandate that psychotherapy should be provided for people who present with that problem. And as you say, the stats from the psychologists are that most do not wish to commit an offence. But if they're marginalized and hated and feel, well, their life is hopeless and they'll never have a relationship, and they're more likely to commit an offence. So, in fact, hatred of paedophiles, and this has been said to me by forensic psychiatrists, hatred of paedophiles and bullying, or whatever, is more likely to lead to a child being offended against, which is is quite a fruity thing to have to think about.
I mean, I did a mediation case many years ago that presented as, social housing, neighbour dispute, but as I got under the skin of it,
Yeah.
part of the problem was a male who was in his late 20s had gotten pregnant, and a neighbour's daughter who was probably 16. She wasn't below the age of consent, but she was 16.
Yeah.
But what happened to him was that all around the estate, all his, rivals and enemies and all the rest of it were calling him a pedo.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's quite scary.
It's very scary. I mean, and I think it's so.
And it all got
does it?
dangerous and violent. That's my point.
Yeah.
It all got
Yeah.
very dangerous. How does that help society?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, the public hatred, the shaming and so on is, we've seen it in the riots going on around immigrant hostels, where people are carrying "Save Our Children" signs. But there's huge hatred and huge anger, but that it does cause enormous trouble. So I've been sitting in on counselling sessions for men who've been arrested for, this is with Stop It Now, which is a brilliant organisation that helps people with a sexual attraction to children with counselling. Counselling sessions with people who've been on the internet, spotted. There's a lot of decoy police on the internet, in the forums and so on, arrested. They can't see their children again. They lose their job. It's reported in the local papers. They go straight onto the Facebook vigilante groups. And these men are saying, I admit I was online drunk late at night. I'm a porn addict. I agree. And I was going down a rabbit hole, but I've no sexual interest in children. I would never believe that. I mean, I wouldn't think about it. And I thank God you stopped me, because it's made me think about what it was. But meanwhile, in their community, they would tar and feather them if they could get through. And you're back to going, what we have to grow compassion. It sounds really hard to say, and understanding of people with a disorder that they can't help. And if we're to go forward and keep children safe. And it's a really hard ask, because it's so easy to go, they should have their balls cut off. They should be, bang them up. It's the only thing, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Well, but that's the issue, isn't it? It doesn't
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
And you're somebody who's been through this. You have survived sexual abuse in boarding school, I think it was.
Yeah.
And so it sort of qualifies you to speak about this. I can understand people's outrage. As a parent, if anyone had come, I mean, my children are grown up, I have grandchildren. If anyone's going to come anywhere near any of my kids, they're going to have to get past me, and that won't be pretty. So I get it. But then we have to look at, but none of that. So I could fend off an incident at a very local level in a very violent way or whatever, but we're not solving the problem at a societal level. That's the issue that why I wanted to talk to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and I think, no, I'm a parent as well, but it's kind of interesting what I went. Well, I mean, the first thing that went wrong with me, I mean, this is not typical at all, is I was sent away to school at 8 years old. I was far too young. No one should be done. Children need love and somewhere they can trust. And the people who are sexually interested in children used to get jobs in those schools, as obviously because children were vulnerable and needed love, and they do in care homes as well to this day. care home system is a terrible mess since they sold it all off to private equity and regulations have been dropped. But and we need to bear that in mind. But it's so but I think the key thing for you and me as mums and dads is I hope I taught my children that they could say anything to me because the shame of particularly for children who've been sexually abused by someone they trusted or loved, the shame and the confusion and so on will make them, and the embarrassment, and will I be in trouble? Did I misunderstand when he did that? Those are crucial. And that awful statistic that 1 in 3 sexually abused children won't will never disclose. And the average one who does disclose takes 17, 18 years to do it. But if we help them disclose, then we can tackle the people. And we're back to catching molesters before they molest or molest
Yeah.
anymore.
And within families, I mean, I remember having friends that we knew were being sexually abused, but we didn't know where to talk about. And in fact, in one particular case, I remember she was talking about it was her own father, and she left home as soon as she possibly could. And she said that in the end, what she understood was her mother looked the other way because
Yeah.
it took the sexual pressure off her mother.
Yes, I mean, I've because I've been doing this investigative work for 2. I mean, I have hundreds and hundreds of interviews and emails from people sexually abused, initially in the schools and care homes, but more widely. And I'm afraid that's a very common story. And I mean, and I think one of the most awful things about child sexual abuse is that done by someone you love or trust is the long-term psychological damage is worse in a funny way, the teacher who put his hands down our shorts and gave us a sweet, who we hated and was a frightening, scary man. But I feel really lucky that it sounds mad, but that was the form my abuse came because I don't feel any confusion or guilt about it. I just hated him and wanted to know why the adults, the headmaster who knew, didn't stop it. But no, so the abuse within that family context is absolutely terrible. And of course, you alluded to this earlier, and it is important again about our understanding about the problem and developing compassion. Is there's a significant proportion of people sexually abused as children who become sexual abusers? It's about 5 to 10%. Because, and it's almost always because this happened to you as a child with someone you loved, and you have to process it in your brain. This has been trauma psychologists explain this. So the easy way to process it goes, it wasn't too bad. I enjoyed it. I mean, on a physical level, that's feasible, and particularly for an older child, it was good for me. He showed me he loved me, and it is almost always men, not entirely, about 5% women, but and of course, then that the traumatized person will take that feeling forward, and that will enable them to. Well, I've interviewed so many child sexual abusers who say, "I knew I did nothing wrong because it was done to me at 9 and I liked it." So again, we're back to understanding compassion because that psychological cognitive dissonance, it that happened to me, so it's okay, is dealable with in therapy. You can deal with it. EMDR will
You can
attack it.
undo it. You certainly can
You
undo
so
it.
can.
Absolutely.
And but we're back to funding and public understanding,
Yeah. And then another family kind of dynamic that I've heard is, men who sexually abuse their own daughters. And I've heard it, saying that sometimes the men will say, well, sooner or later she's going to be exposed to men, and I'd rather it was me that taught her. I mean, how awful. But I
Oh,
mean, I've
yeah, I
heard
can.
that I've heard that trotted out as an excuse or a reason.
Yes. No, and I think that's it. When we were talking earlier about the long history of this, and how the problems we see now, we talk about them now, which we didn't in the past. But there's a really, because I've been researching kind of the modern history of child sexual abuse for the book, which I have to say, is in order to say what we could do better. It's a hopeful book, I hope. Is back in until the 1920s. There was weird stuff in English law where incest was separate from assault. And there was a common belief, among obviously the less educated Britain, that incest was not a crime, that the father had absolute rights over their children, including to have sex with them. And there's a lot of talk in the late 1920s. I mean, not that long ago. I mean, you're my grandparents were alive then. The A lot of talk about how we've got to start talking, educating the public that you don't have sexual rights over your children, and just as people thought they had sexual rights over their wives. And I think what was done to women until really very till this recently in terms of their rights within marriage, their property rights, and and the fact that basically the police wouldn't prosecute domestic violence for decades. This is very similar to what we're talking about with the children, and it's kind of useful to see it in the same lens, I think.
It is, yeah, it is. And children, I mean, I mean, it sounds like I'm going off at a tangent, but the extent to which we don't involve children and don't give them rights of consultation is that up to, I think it may be 10 or 15 years ago, part of the Ofsted framework was student voice. That's
Yes.
been taken away. That's
Yeah, that's
disappeared.
interesting.
Student voice no longer appears as an
Yeah.
Ofsted standard. So you've got kids going into this place called school, this huge pressure cooker every day,
Yeah.
and we've decided that they don't have anything to say about the environment they're in.
That's so interesting. I mean, and I think, if you go back into the 20th century history of neglect more widely and abuse of children, again and again, I've read reports from, inquiries back in the 50s and the 60s, and again and again, you're going, hold on, you said this and this and this, and you said, often they say things like, well, the children were pretty criminal, and particularly in the care homes and or the borstalls and the reform schools, and they were seductive, and it was the adult was innocent, and they're the guilty party. It really awful, stupid things, and then the lobbying of the people the pedophiles who wanted to change the law in the 1970s to get rid of the age of consent.
Oh yeah, let's go there. Let's
And
go
their
there.
arguments all about children's rights. And again, you sit there going, hold on, at what point in all this research and these documents are you going to ask a child how they feel, what they think? Because children, and I think I remember my 9-year-old self, are inherently honest.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
when your kid goes, that's
Yeah,
not fair. You go,
yeah.
oh, for goodness sake, life's not fair. And you go, but actually that's because we taught them to expect justice and truth. And it's really moving actually, because people are so, yeah, trust the child, listen to them, enable them to come forward.
I was chair of a Key Stage 4 pupil referral unit, and our
Oh,
boys
right.
were 14 to 16, going into GCSEs, many already engaged in the criminal justice system. And we
Yeah.
had a problem with phones, them using phones in the class.
Yeah.
And obviously we were going to remove their phones, but I said, as I would, we need to talk to them first. We need to sit down and
Yes.
have a really good conversation about this problem's got out of hand, and let's see
Yeah.
what they have to say. And I had a fabulous discussion, and one young lad, he looked me in the eye because they knew they could say anything, and he said, if you don't know how to run your school properly, why are you coming and asking us to do it for you? Just take the phones off us. If that's what you got to do, take the phones off. And we'll hate you as adults, but that's what you got to do. And I was just like, the honesty.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I think, the message you're saying to children, you are heard, you do have a voice. We're still the adults, but you're not to be pushed around and just, I think, but you go back to the 70s and me and my friends, I mean, the main thing was we weren't believed. We had
That's
the
the issue. We were.
bravery, and I think it's true. Lots of care homes of abuse survivors will tell you that. The bravery to come forward and speak out, knowing that then the evil acts would target them, and then just to go, shut up, you're a malicious little kid. That's so harsh. Yeah, that's a lovely story, Maria. I mean, yeah, talk to children, listen to children. I live in Scotland. I mean, and one of the things I like here is we gave 16-year-olds the vote. And everyone was going, oh no, they're too stupid. That shouldn't happen. And I'm going, no, but actually, but we did it 10 years ago. It's been great. been really good for children's involvement in politics. They're interested in it, in what's going on, and not saying, 16 is a good time to have the vote.
Yeah, well, I feel like we may have gone backwards actually with
Yeah.
removing student voice from Ofsted framework and
Yeah,
this,
I'm
because I
horrified by it.
remember there were lots of political programs when they were talking about it was called ROSLA, raising of the school leaving age from 15 to 16, and the
Yeah,
kids were all involved in the dialogue on TV, but
quite
I
right.
don't think you'd see that now.
No, no, isn't it odd? I mean, because you can marry, they can marry at 16, but they can't vote till 18. What's that about? Um, criminally responsible, from the age of 13, but no say in how the laws are made. I mean, yeah, and I mean, I grew up in the 70s when we used to say, as punks, we said, no, never trust anyone over 30. And I still have a bit in that, I do like younger people with their, and they're the future, we've got to listen to them.
Yeah. So, and then not only do we not listen to children, and then on top of that, we'll tell them that they're lying. Um, and then we will do, what the popular term is victim blaming. Well, for this
Yeah.
to have happened, you must have done something.
Yes. Yeah, and again, that's a long history in the 20th century. I mean, really, particularly look into I mean, it's kind of interesting because obviously grew up in the private school system, but no one ever admitted, where sexual abuse was rife, tolerated. I think the parents colluded in it, and now I've got my data, my spreadsheet has 600 schools and 1,700 allegations from that era. But no, but so a lot of the reports are going, this crime is only done to stupid and poor children, and often because they're morally, they use phrase, it's really right until when the 60s, the government inspectors saying, well, the morally inadequate child, it's not surprising that you know an adult took advantage of them and the adult shouldn't be blamed. It's so that victim blaming thing, particularly around class and poverty, is really, and also particularly women, I think there's a really strong sense. And also, and the other thing that's going on is that courts wouldn't hear the complaint of one child. And so a lot of cases fall apart. And I think, and obviously predators can take advantage of that. I mean, even here in Scotland, we still have a problem with corroboration and domestic violence. It's very hard to prosecute a domestic violence crime just on the wife, well, on the victims. But,
Well, and you see how that plays out. There's a lot of I think there's a really good organisation. I'm trying to think what their name is. It might be Reigns, who are talking about, and then it all plays out in the family court, because the family court want to act as though every couple that come through it, every divorced parents, are both on equal standing,
yes,
and they're both, whatever, bad as each other or as good as each other, and doesn't want to see that there could have been immense power imbalances,
yeah.
huge violence, and it won't acknowledge it.
No, it's a really no, and I don't. I mean, I know the family court system is really, and also expensive and time consuming. Whereas there are conflict resolving systems and mediation and restorative justice and so on that can
So
be done.
there's a lot for us to unpack as a
Yeah.
society.
Yes.
And I think we are kind of beginning to do it. I mean, in some places, as you say, I mean, that example you gave of Germany was really wonderful. Like, are you thinking this? It's okay to think it. People think things.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at some of the violence and sexual content of films, of the
Mm.
movies, someone had to think that stuff
Yes.
for it to become graphically portrayed.
Yeah.
So we
And
haven't reached the point of the thought police yet.
no, well, yes, I hope not. But I mean, and I think there is some really interesting thing going on in the statistics. I mean, one of the great things that kind of academics keep going, particularly to politicians, is violent crime is down, massively down. And then you get Nigel Farage going, well, you'll be mugged as soon as you walk in London. It's just not true. It just really isn't. And it much truer in the 90s and even truer in the 70s. But there are really complex reasons behind that, and it's not necessarily policing or government policy, but it is about what's going on in terms of entertainment, and that it's not so boring to be at home any longer, and sex crime, online sexual crime is massively up, particularly in the child abuse area, because of what's happened in the internet and the availability of vivid pornography and so on, and free. But sexual crimes, contact, real life crimes are again in America, they're down massively. Here, they're kind of stable or going down. So all these things are really interesting and hopeful. But they're also counterintuitive, and you have to kind of get your head around them and look at complex things. Like how do you, if someone has a criminal sexuality, and they used to say homosexuals are criminal until 1967. They need a sexual outlet, and so if you criminalize the pornography and obviously criminalize their real life crimes, what are they actually going to do? How short of being given hormone suppressant drugs, which is a thing, but it doesn't work for everybody. So again, you have to think about really quite difficult solutions.
Well, I want to pick up on that because the whole, chemical castration and, giving.
Yeah.
The problem with that is when those crimes are about power manipulation and control through grooming and all the rest of it, it doesn't kill off that. It
No,
doesn't
I mean,
kill off
I
the
looked
power and control issues that someone might have. So it will just find its way out somewhere else.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting you, Mary.
No,
If
not at all.
my wife is here, all my children, they'd be going, Dad, stop
Oh,
interrupting.
don't worry about it.
My terribly bad habit. The No, I think that issue is really interesting. I mean, and one of the things we don't understand about our ignorance about pedophiles is incredibly different types of people. And some are psychopaths, and those you can chemically castrate, which is basically these whole hormones and sedatives. But the psychologists in sex crime offending say it's only about 10 or 15% of even serious criminals for whom that will have any effect at all. Because, yeah, sex isn't about lust. It's about, particularly violent sex or assault. It's about power and dominance and ego and all those sort of things. And yeah, sex is in the mind, as they always say, and that's the same with criminals too. So you have to be much more clever about how you address the different types of people. I mean, there's I mean, one of again, I'm quoting academic stats and the psychologists who actually work trying to prevent it. I mean, most child abusers, people actually who do go out and molest, seek acquiescence. They want to believe the child said because they're emotionally inadequate. They're horrified by the notion that it's a rape. So they want, and children, of course, can be bullied and groomed into, or
Well,
bribed
that's what the whole
into.
grooming process is. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. The grooming process is a way of the perpetrator convincing themselves
Yes.
that
Yes.
they got the acquiescence or they got the consent or they got whatever. Yeah,
But totally ignoring the fact that
yeah.
you can't give your consent to someone you're in a power relationship with. You could go, well, here's a sweet, can I do this? And you go, yeah, okay. You are my teacher. It's so that's where, yeah, it all falls apart. But but I think, trying to keep the hope in this conversation, you go, if you've got someone whose cognitive process is twisted like that around consent, but they clearly want, they have a conscience there because they want consent. They're not a psychopath. You've got something to work with. You can get into that brain and adapt it. But I mean, we were back to you talking about the services and the hopes of this. I mean, the awful thing is that in Germany, as we said, it's free, and in Scotland, where I live, if you present to stop it now, Scottish government pays the whatever it is, 150 quid for the counselling sessions, and not in England. In England, if you want that help, you've got to cough up. And therapy, I mean, it's not the same as private therapy, which is really expensive, but it is expensive. And I just don't think, like with any other public health problem, that we can go on something so huge, 500,000 children a year, that we can go on not funding the treatment, the
Well,
prevention.
and the trouble is that when we don't fund it, and we don't listen to children, and we do that, people can't help And then you see, you've got people like Jimmy Savile, who we can openly talk about now, where lots of people just look the other way. And clearly the BBC knew what was going on with many of those celebrities. People can't help saying that it's networked and people are covering up, and there are all sorts of connections that
conspiracy.
people, yeah.
Yes, no, and I think that's a really interesting human trait. Is we people and particularly a really ugly and nasty problem. You want the big explanation. You want it, and it's like a series of alien invasion or so on, or has the government been taken over by lizards? But we feel comfortable with them, but they do distract us from actually addressing the problem properly. And a very controversial case in point at the moment is the grooming gangs thing, which people will be rioting on the streets again outside migrant hostels and hotels, again next week, I've no doubt. But the awful, yeah, and the problem with the grooming, clearly there is organised criminal abuse of, people have always got together and to children, but look at the police stats. It's like 1.7% of all child sexual abuse offences per annum. The government just announced a new inquiry into grooming gangs, which is the third child sexual abuse inquiry in 10 years. We spent 300 million on child sexual abuse inquiries. That money, we need to understand why. But if we don't carry out the recommendations, that money is wasted on lawyers. 45% of the money in inquiries goes to lawyers. That money could have been spent on victims and on stopping molesters. So that makes me frustrated, really cross, But it's, if you've got a political problem, you've got the right wing on the rise, and you're trying to hold on to government, announcing an inquiry into something you already know the answer to is an easy political get out.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, completely. I go into prisons and so one of the things I do want to address is, this blanket term sex offender. It's not helpful. Because it just creates a set of people, but that covers a multitude of things, and then what we need to do is work with, as you say, this term paedophile. A paedophile might not necessarily have crossed the line into child molestation, and so let's try and work with people who haven't crossed the line. Let's create the space to talk about, well, firstly there's the compassion for whatever they went through and helping them to undo, because for a great number of people it's just an undoing of whatever got twisted for them as children. And then there's also actually, and there will be real life consequences, and we'd like you to come really face to face with that and understand it before you cross the line.
Absolutely.
We're not, there are certain boundaries in society. We draw some very clear lines, and it's good to talk about. This is the way I talk to people. I say, look, society's drawn a line, and if you decide to push up against that line, it's going to send you a very powerful message. And there's plenty of things you can do not to take yourself there. And I find that's a much better conversation. It opens up much more than saying you're a bad, evil bastard. Which shuts people down.
Yes, and your prison work is exactly the way to, the point to do that, because we know reoffending rates are terribly high. But I was so shocked when I found out, again on my journey of why and discovery, that only 11% of sex offenders of any sort in prison are getting any kind of rehabilitation. And it's it's expensive, but there is no point punishing somebody just so they'll go out and offend again, possibly worse, because now, once they've lost all their ordinary life, they've been jailed. They're never going to speak to their neighbours. They have no family. Never going to speak to them again. They're more likely to offend.
Well, the thing is, one of the consequences of punishment and shame and humiliation is sending something underground. It doesn't go away. You've just sent it underground into darker spaces that are harder to find.
Yes. No, absolutely. And I think, one of the problems is I was talking to a senior police officer in Scotland the other day for the book, and who's in charge of public protection. And she said, she was very frank. She said, the problem, this child sexual online abuse thing, which we're spending a fortune on, and we should do, is we're not, if it was drugs dealing, we'd go after the street dealer, we go after the users to an extent. We go to the street dealers and we go up to the top and the big pushes and the cutter and the OCGs, as the police like to call it, the organized crime groups. In the online porn thing, child abuse, sexual abuse material, it's only the users because the actual pushers are the big internet tech companies who host this stuff, don't police it properly. And I mean, and we don't currently yet, and we're not able to go after. Can I mention their names? I mean, we all know who they are, not least because the Americans, President Trump's regime is threatening us if we try to police those big image sharing platforms that everyone uses every day. But it's that I mean, and that's huge. But you don't end crimes by just punishing criminals. You do it by looking at the causes.
Absolutely. And so we're coming to the end of our time together, and you so eloquently brought us to that point. You can punishment may get temporary compliance, but it doesn't actually really change attitudes or deal with source or address the root problems. So, and you've put a lot of time and effort into this, and I hear you're going to have a book out, which, I'm sure you'll come back on again when the book's out. But where, what is it out of this conversation? What is it you want people really to hear as someone who can speak authoritatively on this subject, not least of all because you are a victim?
Yeah, I mean, I think I keep asking the public to think a bit deeper. They're worried about the sexual abuse of children, and as a parent, we all know that is a number one worry. Be aware of where that actually happens and where the real risks are to you. It isn't a asylum seeker or migrant with a dark skin. It really isn't. It's in your own home, and it's among the people you trust. And I'm afraid that's always been true. So helping your children understand, without horrifying them, but making sure that they have the trust in you to tell you if something's going wrong, and then acting on it, all those things. And then widening our minds to see we need to. It's a public health problem. There's people with a horrible illness. Many of them, it's a diagnosable psychological disorder. Not all, but paedophilia, and but it isn't. You can be a paedophile and not a criminal. Child molester is a criminal. A paedophile is not a child molester. I've learned that. It's been a really hard thing to learn. But some of the psychologists' mass data will say the majority, will never commit a real life offense. They might commit an offense online though, which is of itself a terrible thing. But it's we talked about that. So yeah, sorry, that was a very long answer, Maria. Forgive me. But yeah, no, I think open your minds, understanding. And let's keep children safe, in a way that works and stop knee-jerk reacting.
Yeah, and
It
stop
doesn't work.
saying, but it's happening over there. I mean,
Stop saying it's not about us.
somebody
Yeah.
put it to me that the reason, it might feel a bit left of field, but somebody put it to me that the reason that in the UK we're so fascinated and we're so pumping out so much about Epstein is because we can all go, but that's America.
No, yeah, or it's the Prince Andrew, or
Yeah, it's over there. You
it's
see,
the
it
elite.
isn't.
It's
Yeah,
the elite.
yeah.
But it just isn't. And I think the Epstein thing is a bit of a distraction. I think, Epstein, a terrible criminal who desperately exploited young women for power and influence. But but it is an outlet. It says something about power and influence and how those structures of men work, and that's disgusting. But it's not about keeping children safe. I mean, that's controversial. I mean, you can dig further into it, but in terms of your grandchildren or my grandchildren, I don't have any grandchildren. I hope I do one day. But that's it's not the Epstein thing that we need to be worrying about.
It's looking at, yeah, I mean, you were 9, you said, when this happened to you, you were 9, and I've met other people, and it's how, children at those ages have no way to protect themselves.
No, I hope they do now
They are
more,
completely in the hands of adults around them.
and trusting and trying to work out the world, and that's very easily exploited. And I think particularly children, like me, I was away from my family. I was in a boarding school. We were vulnerable, and there are children without you know a totally trustworthy person around them. You need that. It's crucial, and people will seek out vulnerable children. But yes, that's we can address it.
And thank you for just being willing to speak freely about this topic in ways that, perhaps most people find very difficult to open it up in the way we've opened it up. And I'm really grateful to you for doing that. There's a lot of work to be done. You're certainly making your contribution. I think I'm making a small contribution myself. Let's open this conversation, I think, let's think more deeply about it.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk to you more, Maria. And congratulations for your work. I think particularly the work in prisons is brave and useful and desperately underfunded, as we all know. And I think well done you on that and everything you
Thank
do.
you. We shall talk again soon. Much
Let's do
love to
that.
you. Take
And
care.
you. Big hug.
Bye.
See
Bye.
you.